officers became physically ill. What they found would shock the nation and reveal the twisted mind of a man whose crimes went far beyond murder. This is a story about isolation, obsession, and the darkest corners of human psychology. Before we begin, a content warning. This episode discusses graphic violence, murder, and disturbing behavior. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Edward Theodore Gein was born on the 27th of August, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. He was the second son of George and Augusta Gein. His older brother, Henry, was born in 1901. Ed's childhood was marked by an oppressive and deeply dysfunctional family dynamic that would shape the rest of his life in devastating ways. His father, George, was an alcoholic who struggled to maintain steady employment. He was weak-willed, ineffectual, and frequently the target of his wife's open contempt and verbal abuse. George owned a grocery store that failed, and he worked various jobs as a carpenter and tanner, but never achieved any real success or stability. He was a broken man who provided little guidance or protection for his sons. Augusta Wilhelmine Gein, Ed's mother, was the true force in the household. Born in 1,878 inches, Wisconsin, to German immigrant parents, Augusta was a fanatically religious woman who dominated every aspect of family life with an iron fist. She was a devout Lutheran who held extreme, fundamentalist views about sin, morality, and particularly about women and sexuality. Augusta believed that all women, except herself, were instruments of the devil and vessels of sin and prostitution. She viewed the female body as inherently sinful and sexuality as the ultimate corruption. She preached to her sons constantly, reading them graphic passages from the Old Testament about murder, death, and divine retribution. She was convinced that the world outside their home was a cesspool of immorality that would corrupt her boys if given the chance. Augusta was determined to raise her sons in complete isolation from what she saw as the corrupting influences of society, particularly women. She would tell Ed and Henry that all women were whores and that they were especially wicked because they seduced men and led them away from God. She drilled into her sons that friendship with women led only to heartbreak and disease. Despite her hatred of other women, Augusta considered herself to be different, a righteous and pure woman living in a world of sin. This created a profound psychological split in young Ed's mind between his mother as the only good woman and all other women as evil temptresses. In 1914, when Ed was 8 years old, Augusta had saved enough money from running a small grocery store to purchase a 195-acre farm outside the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, about 40 miles from the nearest city of Wausau. The farm was deliberately chosen for its isolation. It was located on the outskirts of town, far from neighbors, down a long dirt road. Augusta wanted to create a fortress where she could keep her sons away from the outside world, particularly away from girls and women who might corrupt them. The house itself was a 2-story wooden structure, modest and plain, surrounded by fields and forest. The Gein family lived in near total isolation on this remote property. Ed and Henry were allowed to attend the local school because Wisconsin law required it, but Augusta made their lives miserable over it. She discouraged them from making friends and would interrogate them about their day, looking for any sign that they had been corrupted by their classmates. After school, the boys were expected to return immediately to the farm to do endless chores. There were always fences to mend, animals to feed, fields to plow, and work to be done. Augusta used hard labor as both punishment and protection, keeping her sons so we'll never know for certain. But the suspicious circumstances, combined with Ed's later actions, make many believe that this was Ed Gein's first murder. Augusta Gein suffered a paralytic stroke shortly after Henry's death in late 1944. Ed became her full-time caretaker, nursing her with devoted, almost obsessive attention. He bathed her, fed her, helped her with all personal needs. This role gave his life new meaning and purpose. He was completely focused on his mother, his entire existence revolving around her care. She suffered a second, more severe stroke in 1945, and this time she didn't recover. Augusta Gein died on the 29th of December 1945. She was 67 years old. For Ed, this wasn't just the loss of a parent. It was the collapse of his entire world. Ed was devastated by his mother's death in a way that went far beyond normal grief. At 39 years old, he was utterly alone for the first time in his life. The woman who had controlled every aspect of his existence, who had given him identity and purpose, was gone. Ed was completely unprepared for independence. He had no friends, no social skills, no understanding of how to function as an adult in the world. Neighbors reported that he seemed lost and confused in the months after Augusta's death, wandering around town aimlessly, that nervous laugh erupting even more frequently. After Augusta's death, Ed sealed off the parts of the house his mother had used. Her bedroom, the living room where she read scripture, the dining room where they ate together, all became shrines to her memory. He nailed the doors shut or simply never entered these rooms again. Everything was left exactly as it had been the day she died. Her clothes hung in the closet. Her Bible remained on the nightstand. Dust accumulated, but nothing was moved. Ed couldn't bear to disturb anything that had been hers. Meanwhile, he lived in a small back bedroom and the kitchen, allowing these areas to fall into complete disrepair and squalor. Trash piled up, dirty dishes accumulated. The house became a physical manifestation of Ed's psychological state, with the preserved, sanctified shrine to his mother separated from the chaos and filth of his own existence. Ed survived by doing odd jobs for neighbors. He worked as a handyman and did farm work for other families in the area. People in Plainfield remembered him as quiet, somewhat strange, but generally harmless and reliable. He would show up when you needed help, work hard, charge very little for his labor. He was known for his peculiar sense of humor and that nervous, high-pitched giggle that seemed to come at odd moments. Some people found him creepy. Others just thought he was a lonely, simple-minded man who had lived too long under his mother's thumb. Ed had a bizarre habit of babysitting for local families. This is striking because he was a middle-aged bachelor with no children of his own. But several families in Plainfield would leave their children with Ed. He seemed to enjoy the company of children and would entertain them with stories. However, some parents later recalled feeling uncomfortable with how much Ed seemed to enjoy discussing death, violence, and gruesome news stories with the children. He would tell kids about headhunters and cannibals, about how the Nazis had made lampshades from human skin during the war. At the time, parents thought this was just Ed being strange and morbid. They had no idea what was actually happening at his farm. What the people of Plainfield didn't know was that Ed Gein had developed a dark and consuming obsession in the years after his mother's death. He became fascinated with anatomy, spending hours reading anatomy textbooks and medical journals. He was particularly interested in human reproduction and the female body. He read pulp Cemetery, Hancock Cemetery, and Spiritland Cemetery. He would read obituaries carefully, paying special attention to middle-aged and elderly women who had recently died, particularly those who reminded him in some way of his mother. He developed a whole ritual around these expeditions. He would wait for fresh graves, usually visiting within days or weeks of the burial. He always went at night, bringing a shovel and a lantern. Gein later told psychiatrists that he didn't always take the bodies. Sometimes he would simply dig down to the coffin, open it, look at the deceased woman, and then refill the grave and return home. Other times, he She was a large, robust woman with a strong personality, very different from Ed's frail mother, but she was the right age and had that maternal quality that seemed to attract Ed's attention. After Mary's disappearance, customers at other local establishments would occasionally joke with Ed about what might have happened to her. Ed would respond with that nervous giggle and make cryptic, disturbing comments. He told one person, "She isn't missing, she's at the farm right now." People thought he was just being weird, making a tasteless joke. They had no idea he was telling the literal truth. On the 16th of November 1957, the day before as if they were being used as dishware. They found a shoebox containing 9 preserved vulvas. They found 4 faces that had been carefully removed from skulls and treated to preserve them, with twine tied through holes near the ears so they could be worn as masks. The investigators found lampshades and wastebaskets covered in human skin. They found a chair seat and a drum that had been upholstered with human skin. They found a sheath for a hunting knife made from human flesh. They found a purse with a handle made from human skin. They found bracelets made from human skin. They found lips hanging from a string like a grotesque necklace. They found Mary Hogan's face in a paper bag preserved like a mask, with Gein's fingerprints on the bag. They found what appeared to be leggings made from human leg skin, complete with the knee joints still visible. They found fingernails carefully preserved in a box. They found a human head with the skin removed from the skull and facial features still recognizable. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of the mammary vest, as investigators called it. This was a vest made entirely from the skin of a woman's torso, carefully removed and preserved, complete with breasts. It had been constructed with meticulous care, tanned and treated to remain pliable. This was the centerpiece of Ed Gein's woman suit. Along with the leggings and the face masks, Ed could dress himself in the skin of his victims, and quite literally wear them. Officers also found female genitalia preserved in a box, which Gein could attach to the suit to create a complete female appearance. The psychological implications of these items were staggering. This wasn't just murder or necrophilia. This was a complete obsession with transformation, with becoming what he had lost. The sealed rooms, the shrine to Augusta Gein, stood in stark contrast to the horror show in the rest of the house. These rooms were neat, clean, preserved exactly as they had been when she died. Her clothes hanging undisturbed in the closet, her Bible on the nightstand, her bed made with military precision. It was as if 2 completely different people lived in the house. The devoted son maintaining his mother's memory, and the deranged killer creating objects from human remains. Ed Gein was not at home when police arrived at his farm. He had been visiting a neighbor, watching them load equipment for hunting season. Officers found him there and arrested him without incident. He seemed confused and compliant, offering no resistance. When questioned about Bernice Worden, Ed initially denied any knowledge of her disappearance, but as the interrogation continued through the night, with officers telling him what they had found at his property, Ed began to break down. He confessed to killing Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. He described the killings in a detached, emotionless way, as if he were talking about something that had happened to someone else. He said he didn't really remember the details clearly, that he went into a kind of trance or daze when he killed. For Bernice Worden, Gein described driving to her hardware store early on the morning of November 16. He brought his .22 caliber rifle, though he later claimed he didn't consciously plan to kill her. When he entered the store, Bernice was alone. He told her he wanted to buy antifreeze, and as she turned to get it, he shot her in the back of the head. She died instantly. He locked the doors, loaded her body and the cash register into his truck, and drove back to his farm. There, he hung her body in the summer kitchen and began to butcher her the way his mother had taught him to butcher deer when he was young. many of the specific findings were too gruesome for public consumption in the conservative 1,950 seconds. Still, enough information leaked out that the American public became fascinated with the case. The phrase Gein's ghoul and the Plainfield ghoul entered the popular vocabulary. The people of Plainfield were mortified. They had lived next to a monster for years and never suspected. The fact that he had been babysitting their children was particularly horrifying to parents. Ed Gein was held in the Waushara County Jail awaiting trial. In January 1958, he was arraigned on charges of first-degree murder for the death of Bernice Worden. However, two psychiatrists who examined him both concluded that he was mentally incompetent to stand trial. He was found to be suffering from schizophrenia and was unable to assist in his own defense or fully understand the proceedings against him. On the 6th of January 1958, a judge ordered Ed Gein committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. He would spend the next 10 years in psychiatric treatment at this facility. During his time at Central State Hospital, Gein was extensively evaluated by psychiatrists who were trying to understand what had created such a profoundly disturbed individual. The doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia, noting that he had a severe break with reality and lived in a world where the boundaries between life and death, between himself and others, had completely dissolved. They described him as having a divided personality, with one part devoted to the memory of his mother and another part capable of horrifying acts that he couldn't fully acknowledge or remember. The psychiatrists noted his profound sexual confusion, his inability to relate to women as human beings rather than as either saints or objects. They documented his belief that he could become a woman by wearing women's skin, and his conviction that he could bring his mother back or merge with her through these rituals. The psychiatric reports revealed the full extent of Augusta Gein's psychological abuse and the damage it had caused. Ed had been raised to believe that sexuality was evil, that women were either pure like his mother or sinful prostitutes, that his body and his desires were shameful and wrong. When Augusta died, Ed lost his moral compass, his identity, his entire sense of self. The grave robbing and the creation of the woman suit were his way of trying to resolve impossible psychological conflicts, to reconcile his desire for women with his belief that such desire was sinful, to bring back the mother he had lost and depended on completely. Some psychiatrists theorized that Gein's crimes were driven by a desire to literally become his mother, to merge with her, and thus never have to face the terror of being alone. Others believed he was acting out a form of necrophilia, but one that was more about identity and transformation than sexual gratification. Still others saw his actions as a response to profound gender dysphoria, though the concept wasn't well understood in the 1,950 seconds. What all the experts agreed on was that Ed Gein was genuinely with some people believing that Gein's crimes were so calculated and meticulous that he couldn't have been truly insane. But the legal standard for insanity is whether the person knew what they were doing was wrong, and the evidence clearly showed that Gein's grip on reality was so tenuous that he likely didn't fully comprehend the nature of his actions. The Gein property became an immediate source of morbid curiosity. In the days and weeks a film that borrowed heavily from the Gein case. The character of Leatherface, who wears a mask made from human skin, the farmhouse full of furniture made from human remains, and the general atmosphere of rural horror all came directly from the Gein story. The film became one of the most notorious and influential horror films ever made, spawning a franchise that continues to this day. In 1991, The Silence of the Lambs featured the character of Buffalo Bill, a serial killer who murdered women to make a woman's suit from their skin, a concept taken directly from Ed Gein's actual crimes. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture and introduced a new generation to horrors inspired by the Gein case. Numerous other films, books, and television shows have drawn from the Gein story, including Deranged in 1974, which was directly based on Gein's life, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, Ed Gein in 2000, and Ed Gein, The Butcher of Plainfield in 2007. Beyond specific films and characters, the Gein case fundamentally changed how America thought about serial killers and violent crime. Before Ed Gein, most people believed that such extreme violence could only be committed by obviously deranged, evil-looking individuals, or by hardened criminals from urban areas. The popular imagination associated violence with cities, with organized crime, with people who looked dangerous. Ed Gein shattered all those assumptions. He was a quiet, unassuming man from a tiny rural town who seemed harmless, even pitiable, to his neighbors. He demonstrated that the most dangerous people can hide in plain sight, appearing normal or even pathetic, while harboring unimaginable darkness. This realization sparked a new awareness in American culture about the banality of evil, the idea that monsters don't always look like monsters. The Gein case also marked a turning point in how the media covered violent crime. This was one of the first cases where graphic details of a serial killer's crimes were widely reported and discussed in the mainstream press. While newspapers in the 1,950 seconds were still relatively restrained compared to today's media, the Gein case pushed boundaries. People were simultaneously horrified and fascinated. The case helped create the template for modern true crime coverage, where the psychological profile of the killer becomes as important as the crimes themselves. Psychologists and criminologists have studied the Gein case extensively over the decades, trying to understand what creates such a profoundly disturbed individual. Most experts point to a toxic combination of factors: his domineering, psychologically abusive mother, his complete social isolation from normal human relationships, severe mental illness, and the complete absence of any healthy male role model or counterbalance to Augusta's influence. Augusta Gein's extreme religious beliefs about women, sexuality, and sin, combined with her total control over her son's life and development, created a profoundly confused and damaged psyche. Ed never learned to see women as human beings with their own autonomy and value. To him, they were either saints like his mother or sinful objects to be used. When Augusta died, Ed lost the only structure and meaning his life had ever had. His already fragile grip on reality collapsed entirely. Some experts have noted that Gein's crimes, while horrifying beyond measure, were not primarily about violence or sexual sadism in the conventional sense that we associate with serial killers. They were about identity, transformation, and an impossible desire to bring his mother back or to become her himself. His grave robbing and his creation of the woman's suit were desperate, psychotic attempts to resolve profound psychological conflicts about gender, sexuality, his own identity, and his relationship is available, and no one should have to face these struggles alone. Thank you so much for listening to the ASMR Casebook. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to follow the channel and share it with